Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to this week's Inspiring Leadership podcast. And I am delighted to have all the way from Perth in Western Australia, Mike Deeks. Mike is the Group MD for Blue Ocean Marine Tech Systems, but he was also a very popular and very well-respected Commodore in the Royal Australian Navy, serving for 32 years. He led the Australian Submarine Force 2001 to 2004, and he was awarded the Conspicuous Service Cross, which is a huge award. He also was the Agents General for Western Australia. It's a link between Australian states and the motherland, based in London, almost like a semi-diplomatic role, and now in business. That lovely combination between a leader in the armed forces and a leader in business. Mike, welcome.
Thank you, Jonathan. I'm delighted to be here, and I do hope I can do your podcast title justice.
I think you can. And it was actually Commodore Peter Scott, Scotty, as we call him, who wrote that great book and is now doing coaching, but also running some sort of ultra marathons and various things. When I asked him, I said, who did you find inspiring? He said, the man I find is inspiring is Mike Deeks, but he'll tell you he doesn't feel he earns the award, but that's always the person I like to talk to, the one who goes, no, not me, but these people are inspiring. It's the one who say, yeah, do you know what? I am massively inspiring. I'm just like, people love me. I go, no, that's not the right one. But look, Mike, really good having you on. And let's begin this whole theme of inspiring leaders who bring the best out of the people that they lead. And, was it that one, Sun Tzu, the greatest leaders, the people said, we did it ourselves, because it's not about that leader. So you were talking to me about a couple of people that you found inspiring leaders. Do you want to say who they are and what was it about them that you found and others found inspiring?
I gave this a lot of thought, Jonathan, and it wasn't for a lack of people I could choose. In fact, the list was quite substantial, but I've chosen two individuals, one who served with me in the Navy and another who I worked for in industry subsequently. First person is Commodore Kim Pitt. Now, Kim was also a submariner, and I interacted with him on a number of occasions through my career in a number of roles that he and I were in at various times. But the one I want to sort of mention now is when I came back from the UK, having just finished Perisher and took command of my first submarine out of Sydney. He was the submarine force commander, Captain SM, as he was entitled. And I found him to be just a terrific foil for me. I was young and enthusiastic and eager to get out to sea, and he was really encouraging in that. But at the same time, he offered me some very sage advice without being directive. It was there for my taking if I wished to have it. He actually encouraged individualism and free thinking, but overlaid with the benefit of some of his experiences and his advice. And it turned out to be very prescient because in my first week at sea, I was exercising with some Australian warships off the coast, and there was an incident where one of the Australian warships did something which endangered my submarine. And the commanding officer of that ship was senior to me, and I raised the issue, and he disagreed with my perspective. And Kim Pitt, as Captain Pitt as he was then, backed me to the hilt and was incredibly supportive. It went up to the sort of admiral level, and he was right there by my side, and ultimately I was proven correct, and the commanding officer of the destroyer backed down. So he was very loyal to his people, and it always meant that whenever I was at sea, I knew there was someone back ashore, watching my back. He was very supportive of our families. So if there was ever an issue where he needed to contact my wife or she needed to contact me, more often than not, we'd go through him, and he would take steps to make sure that whatever needed to happen happened.
Yeah, so yeah. Just staying with that for a minute, you reminded me that, when you're away and often you're out of communications for long periods of time, very hard for spouses of people who are on board a submarine, whether now I think it's male and female, a mixture, but at the time it's just probably in those early years, just the men. But I remember hearing my late mother saying that when my father was away in what we used to call the Far East, but around Singapore, when Suharto was rattling his saber and trying to close the Malacca Straits, the Navy kept sailing through it to keep the lanes open. But they wouldn't hear for them for 6 months to a year. And in those days, there was such poor communication, no mobile phones. So she had to badger certain members in the base station to include a note that, Seaman Johnson's wife's just given birth to a baby boy, to get that slipped in there somewhere. And no, we can't. This is against the regulations. He needs to know, So it was. I do relate to that. But that wasn't the other thought I had, which was you very quickly mentioned when I'd completed Perisher. Now, a lot of people in the 130 countries around the world will not know what the Perisher course is, but I heard it described as one of the toughest selection courses ever. If you take out Navy SEAL training and airborne selection, but just in the intellectual and the pressure and the knowledge you have to have. Do you want to just explain, before you go on to number 2, what Perisher is? Because it's a hell of an achievement to pass it, because very few do pass it.
As an executive officer in the Navy, what called a seaman officer, in submarines, you aspire to command, but there's a massive roadblock to you getting into command, and that is Perisher. And the Royal Australian Navy did Perisher with the Royal Navy for many years, up until the British Navy paid off all of their diesel electric submarines and went to a complete nuclear force, and then we switched across to doing it with the Dutch. I was very fortunate to do it with the Royal Navy in the late 80s. In the preceding Perisher, I was a second in command of a submarine, and I was eager and busting to do Perisher. And after a year in that role, my commanding officer told me, no, I'm not ready, and I had to go and do another job as a second in command, and I was not happy, to be honest. But in fact, I look back now and he was absolutely right. When I went on Perisher, having then spent 3 years in that second in command role, I felt very ready and able to do the course. And I passed it. It wasn't without its hiccups along the way. There were a couple of shaky moments when I didn't do a couple of the operations particularly well. But what I hadn't expected, but what was very much true, is that Perisher is actually a learning course. There's no pass or fail. You are left, whether you get through or not is totally up to the call of the officer running the course, who's a post-command senior submariner. His nickname on the course is Teacher, and Teacher has absolute say as to whether you pass or fail. And he will give you maximum time to pass. So if you're a little bit shaky in some of the operations, you'll do another operation and see if you can improve on what you did. But the most important lesson I learned on Perisher was actually about myself, and about how my actions, my body language, my words affected the crew of the submarine. And it's wrong to say it's an act, but it is important that you present yourself as a competent and capable commanding officer. And I managed to do that and pass, and then had 3 submarine commands.
Yeah, well, congratulations on that. Huge achievement. And I do like that, because I'm thinking of some of the CEOs that I'm coaching at the moment around the world. And some of them get it, but 1 or 2 of the others are, this is me, take it or leave it. And they're not they're pretty ambivalent about the impact they have on other people and how they leave people feeling. I think someone once said, people forget what you say, they forget what you do, but they never forget how you make them feel. And that kind of arrogance worries me, that, look, this is my style, this is my recipe, I'm going to apply it to every job I have, regardless of the people in it or what their capabilities are like. And I think that's at their peril. I don't know what you think before we go on to your next inspiring leader, but any thoughts on that?
Well, yeah, can I actually just tell you something that I have done as a sort of impromptu study, and that is I've looked at submarine commanding officers, Australian submarine commanding officers, and the honour board in the submarine headquarters building now has probably about 40 or 50 in the time that the Australian Navy has had submarines. So it's a pretty small pool. But what I note about the ones I've met personally and know personally is that there is no standard personality type for commanding a submarine. People of all walks of life, very clever people, people that struggled with maths and science, uh, people who were extroverts, people who were introverts. They've all commanded submarines successfully. And if you get through Perisher, then it's very unusual for you not to have a successful command because you're so well prepared. So my analysis of that, and this is very much an amateur analysis, is what is it about the fact that people from so many different styles can be successful as a commanding officer? And what I've concluded is that it is about emotional intelligence. It's knowing yourself and knowing the impact of your actions and words on others. So if you are an introvert and you spend a lot of time in your cabin, quietly reading a book rather than necessarily circulating or interacting with people, as long as you know that and therefore know what to expect from your crew, that's fine. I've also known some absolute extroverts who do some outrageous things in the control room. The crew love them. They react to it in a very positive way. So, yeah, that's my take on that particular small
No,
sum.
I think that's a very fair one. And I think, judging by the number of leadership books that have been written, my wife and my own included to the list of hundreds of thousands of books on leadership, is no one's found the silver bullet that, do this and you'll be a great leader. Because as you say, it depends on circumstances, on who you are, on who you're leading, on whether you're lucky or not. That was always the big thing from Napoleon. I want lucky generals, not just good generals. They've got to be lucky ones. And also on your willingness, as you say, to develop high levels of emotional and social intelligence, to read others, to understand what they need and their unique circumstances, and to take their own ego out of the game. That there's unfortunately too many massive egos around. No, it doesn't stop being a flamboyant character, but if you can be prepared to be wrong, apologize, rectify it, and learn from it, that's fine. It's the ones that when I ask them, when was the last time personally you were dead wrong? And a leader says to me, do you know what? I can't think of a time I was wrong. Maybe in 1978, but that wasn't really my fault. That was somebody else's. Then you've got an arrogant so-and-so, and it's going to cause problems. And it's 15% of CEOs are in the dark triad of subclinical psychopathy, narcissism, and Machiavellianism. That's a very high number, much higher than you'll find in anywhere else. Now,
That's quite concerning.
It's deeply concerning because it feeds the narcissism. You only need to look at someone like Trump or Liz Truss in Britain and America. That's a classic dark triad kind of behaviors. And if you have that in your CEO, you've got a problem. But there are a number of them around. I've met them. And it has a long trail of destruction behind their glory, and the lives that are damaged. So if we can find, as you say, among those 40, such a cross section of diversity, but that at the end of it, people willingly follow them because they know they care about, in this case, the ship, the crew, the mission, and they will look after their crew, then that's fine. But if people follow them out of curiosity about what they'll do next, that's a problem. Or what does the boss want? Let's just give the boss what he wants rather than what's right for the ship or what's right for the organization. What do you think?
Yeah, absolutely. I think you've got to give people freedom and confidence to say what they believe is right. I know for a fact it's very rare for me to be the smartest guy in the room. and I'm quite happy to take on whatever role I need to within that hierarchy of people smarter than I. My career shows that I'm a jack of all trades and master of none, and so that ability to instill in your people the confidence to say, "Sir, you've got no clothes on," is very, very important.
Yeah,
That's the only
two thoughts were triggered from that. One is, if you are the smartest person in the room, someone said to me, "You're in the wrong room," and the second one was, a lot of people love this idea of being the smartest man in the room, and everybody waits for what drips from their mouth. A bit like Napoleon, who was supremely clever and smart and ahead of his game from strategy to tactics. At the age of 28, he'd captured Milan. He was then writing out the instructions for the orphanage in Milan, all the details of it. He thought it through and wrote it out as the instructions for it, at the same time as grand strategy against Austria and Russia. These people are rare, but they've then got to make sure they have people who can think for themselves. Though he had a problem with Marshal Ney, who rushed off and did rather foolish things when he wasn't around. But I think generally we do need leaders who have an army of giants around them, people who are metaphorically taller than them in their subject matter area, and they're not intimidated by that, or take them out as competitors and eat their children, as someone once described it. That the next generation of leaders are prevented because the boss wants to look the best.
Yeah, I can relate a story from my career that probably addresses that point. After a lifetime in submarines, I had commanded 3 of them, and I thought my seagoing days were over. And the Navy the Chief of Navy kindly threw me the keys to the tanker HMAS Success, a 20,000-ton fleet replenishment ship, and offered me a command. And I was over the moon. And I came home to my wife, Jenny, and said to her, guess what? Good news. I'm going back to sea, going to drive this tanker. And it's probably an exaggeration to say she went a bit ashen-faced, but there was certainly a reaction along the lines of, well, what do you know about driving a tanker? You've been spending your life on 2,000-ton submarines, and this is a 20,000-ton tanker. And it sort of sobered me up a little bit in my enthusiasm. But as I thought it through, I said to her, look, I think what the Navy is saying here is, we're confident that you know how to lead people and get the best out of them. And so when I went on board that ship, I had a highly experienced navigator who'd navigated deep draft ships, very experienced engineer and a supplier. So all the heads of department were the top of their game. And so my task was not to be an expert on how to do replenishment ops at sea. Sure, I had to learn some things, but it was to know how to get the best of those subject matter experts, ask the right questions, challenge their thinking, and I got successfully through that command. So it must have worked.
Yeah, I do think that's a really good story and a very powerful one about making use of the talent you have. And it is a fine line. Do you just take on everybody you're given? And I think in the Navy, as when I was in the Army, you didn't really have much choice. You had to take what they gave you. You couldn't refresh your team and just sack them all and then get a whole load more in. But in business, I do see CEOs do that a lot. They bring their own people with them, and quickly fire a lot of people, and then have those who are complete loyalists to them and can execute and get shit done, as people say, kick down doors and take rooms. But I do think they dodge the challenge of bringing on somebody who wasn't their own person, who might be a bit of a challenge to them, but finding out their talents and bringing out the best in them. And I think that's a sign of a really good leader who really gets to know each person and what would bring the best out in them. What do you think, Mike?
Yeah, well, I can relate very much to that story. When I left the Navy and moved into business, it took me some time to realize that there were people that were doing just that. They were surrounding themselves with these smart people that they brought along from somewhere else. Where my background in the Navy was exactly as you described. the naval pointer, gives you a crew, and it's up to you to work them into an efficient and viable team. And you have to bring the lower performers up. And you have to work with the material you've got, and you've got very little opportunity to change out the low performers. You just got to make it work. And so, yeah, it was a completely different mindset. It took me a long while to figure out that people in industry work from a different perspective.
Yes, and often grandmothers are thrown under buses to further their own careers. That was fascinating about Kim Pitt, and it triggered, as you know, so many other conversations. Who would be the other one? You mentioned someone in business. Who would be your choice there?
Yeah. So I worked for a company called CIVMEC, CIVMEC, which is a West Australian-based steel fabrication concreter company that it was founded by two Irishmen who met in Australia. And one's the CEO and the other is the executive chairman. He's the one I want to focus on this one. They're both outstanding leaders, but Jim Fitzgerald is the executive chairman of CIVMEC. And in something not long over 10 years, he's grown the company from nothing, startup, to over 3,000 people.
Wow.
And it is a very, very impressive organisation. As I said, Jim's an Irishman, grew up very humble background in a village in Ireland, which I can't recall. Limited education, became a tradesman, got a steel fabrication qualification. Came to Australia at some stage, and anyway, long story short, he ended up founding this company with the other Irishman, Pat, and they grew it out of nothing. They took me on. Jim took me on very short notice. We met on a Wednesday, and I started work there the following Monday. He was very quick to engage me and bring me into the team. The business, he wanted to grow a defence element of the business, a defence division. So that was my role. And we then, about 6 or 8 months later, we bought an existing defence shipbuilding company, and I became the managing director of that under CIVMEC. But right through that whole time, Jim was a very engaging person, and he was a very hands-on person. So we had this massive workshop, huge workshop, probably the largest in Australia, I think. And it would not be unexpected to find Jim down there on the tools in the workshop. And a quick story I relate. So there was a young labourer who'd been working up north in the mines, but didn't really enjoy it. And his brother was working for CIVMEC, and his brother said, "Come down and get a job at CIVMEC. It's a great company. You'll love it." So he got a job as a labourer in the workshop, and he'd been tasked by his foreman to get some steel shifted from one location to another. So he had to find a forklift driver to move the steel. He found one and said, "Be over here in 5 minutes and I'll move the steel." The guy didn't turn up. He went looking for another one, found him, spoke pretty abruptly and used a few expletives to say, "I need to get this job done. Get over here and shift this steel." The guy came over, used the forklift, shifted the steel. He then found out that the guy he was swearing at was the executive chairman, Jim, driving the forklift, right? So Jim struck up a conversation with him and learnt that, in fact, this fellow was a qualified accountant and was just doing this labouring job because his brother said it was a good idea and blah, blah, blah. Jim said to him, "Well, would you like to do accountancy?" He said, yeah, sure. And at this stage, this guy had long hair, was a grubby sort of looking fellow. Jim said to him, "Look, go and get your hair cut, get some decent clothes, report to the office on Monday. I'll give you a 3-week trial in the accounting department." That was at least 7 years ago, maybe longer now. That guy is an absolute loyal member of the CIVMEC team. He's now a project finance manager, so he's come up, and he's he's just dedicated to Jim.
Wow.
Jim gave him a chance, but I've seen Jim. He's very demanding, very high standards. The cleanliness of the workshop is something I can't get over, and it was always Jim driving it. But at the same time, when people did a good job, he celebrates success.
Yeah.
reward him for that. And so
Wow.
I really found him, it was a hard man to work for, but an absolute pleasure to work for.
Yeah.
And
Well,
is now a good friend of mine.
well,
So,
amazing. And tell him when you have a chat with him that I've married to an Irish family from Bundoran in Donegal, and so tell him I'd be delighted to hear his stories because you're a great example of leaders. Leaders are great storytellers. They're not making up stories. They're stories that motivate and inspire people to. Because if you think if you go back to our Stone Age and our medieval time, no one wrote anything down. They just shared stories which had morals and lessons and leadership inspiration. And you do this really well, Mike. So, talking of stories, I'm always very interested in the experiences in your life that have shaped you into the leader you are today, Mike. From your very earliest days, who you were born to, who your parents were. You can't choose who your parents were and the religion you were born into and where you were born. But tell us a bit about that and how that's shaped the man you are today.
I will, but just before I do that, one last story about Jim. He has never forgotten his roots. He sponsors the local hurling team in the village he comes from. They wear Civmec on their shirts, and I'm sure that 99% of them have got no idea what Civmec is. It's not in Ireland, but he does it as a way of giving back to his society where he's from. So, and he doesn't make a big thing of it. He just does it. Yeah.
That's lovely. What a
All
what a
right.
special guy. Yeah. So your story.
So mine. So I was born in the UK in Ilford in Essex.
Yeah.
My father was a City of London policeman in the city, the square mile, and I'm one of four children, and we were well loved and looked after. My parents were both Christians. We were very active in our church, and my parents, I guess, had a sense of service. So my dad did quite a lot of lay preaching in the church. My mum was involved in various activities in the church. Later on, she got involved in Girl Guide leadership as my sister got older. They adopted my sister, and that wasn't an easy process. She wasn't a baby; she was 2 when we adopted her. And my parents already had my older brother and myself. We adopted my sister, and then some couple of years later, they had another son. So it was 4 of us. And at some point in their thinking, as we were growing up, they decided to immigrate to Australia as what we call 10-pound POMs, which is an expression you may have heard. What that means is they paid £10 for each of the adults, and children under 19 were free. And at that stage, my older brother was 10 and I was 8. So we came out to Australia on a ship. It was a massively large step for them to take. They left the UK convinced that they would never see their parents again. They felt it was a one-way trip, and this was in 1966. They felt that that was it. I remember a mother of one of my friends pulled up my mother in the street and she said, "How could you possibly take your family to Australia? You know, there are no schools there. There's kangaroos jumping down the main street." They had the very little understanding of what Australia was like at that stage. Anyway, we came out and settled in Adelaide. But for me personally, the trip out was fascinating. 4 weeks on a ship, came down through the Med, through the Suez Canal, the Red Sea, and out into the Indian Ocean. As we crossed the Indian Ocean, we hit a storm, and all the furniture was strapped down. There was only sandwiches coming out of the galley, and of course, a lot of the passengers were chronically seasick. They weren't seafarers. A little 8-year-old Mike, me, wasn't seasick, and one of the women passengers that my mum had befriended said to me, "Little boy, you don't get seasick. You should join the Navy." And the moral of this story is be careful what you say to 8-year-olds, because from that moment on, I was going to join the Navy.
Wow.
And I've got no naval connection at all in my family, as far as I can ascertain. And then, so settling in Adelaide, I had this continuous expectation that I'd join the Navy. And then in 1972, a brand new commissioned ship, the HMAS Torrens, which had been built in Sydney, named after the River Torrens that flows through Adelaide, came to Adelaide for its maiden visit. Big news. They were given freedom of the city, open to the public, and I said to my parents, "They're open to the public. Can I go and have a look?" And I did. We did. And on board that ship, a young lieutenant told my mum how I could join as a 15-year-old. And I researched it and found that applications were about to open. I was 14, turning 15 at the end of the year. I applied, went through the whole process, and joined in early 73 at the age of 15 and 2 months.
Wow. Wow.
Yeah.
And you joined as what? Just as a rating?
No, as what's a rank that doesn't exist now. It's called a cadet midshipman. So it's
Cadet
below a
midshipman. Yeah. My father was a cadet midshipman
All right.
on
Right.
HMS Belfast. Yeah.
Right. So in those the scheme I entered in, you then did your last 2 years of high school in the Navy at the Naval College, and then had a choice of doing a bachelor's degree or a sort of more naval-oriented course. I opted for a degree and went up to Sydney and did a Bachelor of Arts.
Yeah. Wow. And the rest we've discussed, and getting on to leading the Australian Submarine Force, as well as 3 submarines, each of about 2,000 tons, and then a 20,000-ton tanker. So great experiences that you've had, Mike. And also I find many of the inspiring leaders I have the privilege of interviewing have also had some dark moments in their work and their personal life, which have shaped them, because it's not the fact we have problems, it's how we handle them that marks out the inspiring leaders from the very average leaders. What was a dark moment that you'd talk about, and what did you learn from it?
When I was newly married and we'd had our first child, we were living in Sydney, and my family were living in Canberra, which is about a 4-hour drive away. My mother and her mother, my grandmother, were driving up from Canberra on the Friday night to come to my son's christening on the Saturday, which is going to be held on board a ship. And they had a car accident and both were killed.
Wow.
My mum was 44. I've now got a 45-year-old son that hit that boy who was about to have his christening. So it doesn't. I don't miss the fact that he's now older than she was when she passed. So that was an awful time of our lives. That both my mother and my grandmother were just wonderful, wonderful people. And as I was embarking on my married life with my new son, my brother was in a similar situation. I think he'd just had a daughter. We were so excited about the fact that we had this wonderful lady, our mother, who was going to be part of our children's lives, and it was just cut short. So what did I learn from that? What's the takeaway for me? One is, the most obvious one, of course, is don't take life for granted. Make the most of every day of your life. The less obvious but equally important is the role of the extended family in raising children. With me being away so much in the Navy, it was evident that my wife, who's a very capable lady, but she needed to draw on a wider circle of relatives and friends to assist her with raising our children. With the loss of my mother, that left a gaping hole. Fortunately, my children had a wonderful grandmother on my wife's side who contributed in a very significant way to their upbringing and was very engaged. And I'm blessed, they're blessed with their wonderful mother, my wife Jenny, who's incredibly resilient, very capable, and very kind and considerate. And so she's been a sort of terrific role model for them as they've grown up while I've been away in the Navy. But yeah, very sad event. And I still think so often today, I can't count the number of times I've made the comment to Jenny, wouldn't it have been lovely if my mum was here to see this?
Yeah.
Wouldn't it have been lovely if she could have participated in this?
Firstly, I'm so sorry. because I just can't imagine how horrendous that was. And secondly, I relate to that comment you just made, where many a time I've said, my father was 33 when he was killed flying off HMS Victorious due to a faulty manufacture in the turbine, which caused the blade to break off at high speed and go through the aircraft, causing a fire, which caused him to eject, and the ejector seat misfired and sent him in the tailpiece, and he was washed up a couple of days later in Singapore, Changi Bay. That 33 years old, my mother was widowed, bringing up three boys on her own, and time and again, I just say, I wish my dad had been around to see this, or see me get commissioned as an officer at Sandhurst, or go back as instructor, or win the various things that I did over the years. And also, like you, really miss not having my mother around now that we've got two grandchildren and a third one due, a little baby girl due in the 31st of July to my daughter, Bryony. These are special moments when, your children are having their own children, and wouldn't it have been so lovely to have people around? You can't make them come back. They've gone, but just, it doesn't stop you still wishing for things.
Yeah.
But no, I'm really sorry that, gosh, what an experience, and it will stay with you, particularly when it's such a big event like a christening and everybody's coming to it, and then from what was a joyful thing, death and destruction follow. It just these things stay with us a long time. But thinking back to your upbringing, and there you were at 14, just turning 15, keen to join the Navy, had been from the age of 8 when the woman had said, you should join the Navy because you haven't been seasick. What advice would you give to young men and women 16 to 18 at their stage of life? If you went back to see Mike Deeks at that age, all the experience you've learnt from all those mistakes you've made. What was it somebody once said to me? I learned so much from all my mistakes. I think I'll go and make a few more. What advice would you give to the young Mike or other Michaelas or people who are listening? A tip and a warning, as it were, what to watch out for?
Yeah, it's a very hard question. I've tried to relate it back to me when I was 15, 16, and what I'd have liked to have known or done differently as I progressed from there. One of the things I'd love to have done differently was I should have kept a diary. Peter Scott, as you know, you may know, kept very good diaries right throughout his working life. I don't know when he started them, but it was a great source of inspiration for him and a resource for him writing his book. The other thing I haven't kept, but my wife kept, she kept every letter I've ever written to her. And I've kept a few, but very, very few. And I wish I'd kept all of those letters that she's written to me and my other family members have written to me. It would have been something that I'd have just enjoyed so much going back over. But in terms of advice, I guess, it probably comes down to being yourself. One of the things I would have liked to have known a little more about as I entered into my naval career was I'd love to have had a clearer picture of what being in the Navy meant in terms of sacrifices of a serving naval officer and their families that I needed to be prepared for. And I really went into it incredibly naively. I'm not sure if I'd known more about it. I don't think I would have changed my mind. I've continued on the path. But it would have been really nice to understand more about what the future held in terms of my relationships with my children. One of the disappointments of my life is that because of my naval career, because of away at sea so much, I could never really be my son's soccer coach, or I've missed so many key events at school for all of my children. My older daughter was the school captain of her school. I missed her inauguration completely. I was away. Yeah, two of my three children's births were induced to fit in with the naval program. So it's a huge sacrifice, and I'd love to have known a little bit more about that at the start. I'm not sure
Yeah.
if that's advice that I can give to other people, but it certainly is
No,
what I.
no, I think, and very, very meaningful, very meaningful. And I, uh, I think a lot of people don't kind of realize when they serve their, in this case, king and country, but certainly serve their country in the armed forces or police or fire service, just what sacrifices they will have to make. And sometimes the partners aren't really happy that they're having to make those sacrifices and don't feel that was the contract they signed up to. And it is a tough one. There's many other questions we could talk about on the Inspiring Leadership Compass. There's about 8 elements, from sort of moral quotients to what gives your life meaning and purpose, to health, emotional intelligence, collaborative intelligence, resilience, brand, legacy. But in the time we have, is there any particular ones that you'd like to speak about, Mike, that you think would bring some good lessons for people in the 130 different countries around the world that are listening to our conversation today?
I guess the one that was quite hard for me to answer when we went through these questions was the brand
Yeah.
quotient. But in fact, it led me to think a lot about what that meant and what it meant to me. And I guess it probably lies at the heart of why I am who I am, and why Scotty spoke so highly of me and the like. And I've always just been myself. I've never. My wife would have said early in my life I was too quiet and too introverted. That's just how I was at the time. I probably gained some confidence over the years, but um, as I said earlier, I've always felt that I can learn more from other people than they can necessarily learn from me. And I guess, when you're talking about classic leadership styles, I would put myself in the position of a servant leader. So, what can I do to make my team's life easier, more fun, and give them all the resources they need to do what I need them to do? Um, when Peter was my navigator in Orion, um, we were faced with a final task in our operational workup. So this was the highest level of operational readiness you get to in a submarine. And we were confronted with a very, very difficult inshore operation that we had to do. And it was in New Zealand. And Peter came to me with a plan. He'd done some really good calculations and proved that we could actually get inside this harbour that on first glance you would never have considered taking a submarine into. And he laid out the plan and convinced me that we should do it, for a number of reasons. One, it was doable because he proved it could be done, but also we suspected that the opposition that was going to be up against us, which we expected some helicopters and maybe a patrolling ship or whatever, would never, ever figure that we could get in there. It was just too tight. And so we did it. And so, in a nutshell, that's a sort of, I guess it displays my brand, what I think is my brand, in that I allowed Scotty, who was the navigator, and therefore this was his role, to convince me that this could be done. And we did it.
Wow.
And we blew the socks off we had the captain SM of the day riding us and assessing us. We blew his socks off. He couldn't believe we did it, and it was hairy. And I did say at one stage to the coxswain on the helm of the submarine, after I just put the periscope down for a quick look, I said, I'm really glad you can't see where we are, because you'd be having kittens if you knew where you were peering through at the time. But yeah, so I guess, yeah, that's my brand, is trust others to do the right thing by me and support me.
Yeah, I love that. And I think we were lucky enough on episode 299 to have Stephen Covey, the son of Stephen Covey Sr., who wrote The 7 Habits of Highly Effective People, which is a seminal book about 50 years ago, which is still relevant today. And his book that he did with a number of other people, including David Casperson, who I'm having on, was Trust and Inspire rather than Command and Control. And many people think that officers like yourself and myself would be very much command and control. But actually, no, you are a trust and inspire leader, one who trusted Scotty, and you inspired others to inspire the people they lead. And I think there's too few trust and inspire leaders around. They fall back on controlling everything and being paranoid and having lots of staff running around briefing them for all the options, rather than letting people elevate and empowering them. We're almost at the end. So before we do the 2-minute top tip, favorite books and why you'd recommend we listen to them.
Okay, well, I've got probably two extremely different books here. The first is, I love the George MacDonald Fraser Flashman books.
Yeah.
And I love them because of the way he writes them and the way they are presented as if they are an authoritative history with footnotes and the like. So I like that style, but I love the rogue that Flashman is, an absolute cad. And when I read Flashman, and I've read all of the Flashman series, and I've read a number of them several times, it's a complete release. You could just enjoy the book. It's just fun. So I love that. That's my turn off read, my holiday read.
Yeah.
The other book that I'd mentioned is written by a submariner, Hugh Dacre Stoker, who was a Royal Navy submariner, but he was the commanding officer of AE2, which was the first. The Australian Navy bought two submarines, AE1, which is Australian E-class #1 and Australian E-class #2, in 1914. And he was the commanding officer of AE2. And he wrote a book called Straws in the Wind in 1925. And it basically, what he did with that submarine, he's probably, he should have got a VC. There's no doubt in my mind he should have got a VC. If you recall, in early 1915, the British or the Allies were looking to penetrate the Dardanelles to get into the Sea of Marmara.
Yeah.
And several warships had attempted it, and there was a couple of them sunk, if I recall correctly.
Yep.
Damaged, and several submarines, Allied submarines, had tried and had not succeeded. And it came to Stoker for him to give it a go, and he tried on one occasion and had a defect on the planes, the depth controllers. So came back out to Malta, had that fixed, and a night or two later went back in. Just to describe the Dardanelles, narrow strait, probably no more than a mile wide at most, sometimes narrower, heavily defended with gunnery emplacements, spotlights, patrolling boats, and the like. Now, what Stoker did differently to the others that tried was he tried to spend time deep wherever he could and navigate by dead reckoning. That wasn't always successful, and twice, as he made his way up the straits, he ran aground. And on both of those occasions, he actually ran aground and ran up a bank, so he was out of the water. It was exposed. Fortunately, on both of those occasions, he was near gun emplacements that he was so close to they couldn't depress the elevation of the gun low enough to shoot at him, and he managed to back off the sandbanks and get back into deeper water. The other advantage that proved to be the case, because he spent more time deep, was that whilst that was known that there was a current coming out of the Sea of Marmara through the Dardanelles Straits, what was not known was that there was a countercurrent deep that he got advantage of, and so he got through, because the batteries of those submarines were not particularly high endurance, and so it would have been difficult for him to get all the way through. But his leadership, the way he kept the morale of his team up as they were penetrating these straits, was quite incredible. And the one anecdote that sticks in my mind was they'd run ashore, they'd run aground, they'd been hammered by patrolling ships. They had trawlers trawling wires and things trying to snag them. And at one stage, he decided just to go and sit on the bottom in the middle of the channel and have a rest, give the crew a break. And in the book, it basically says words to the effect of, we sat on the bottom, and being Sunday, we held a church service. Now, the prescience of the man to actually recognise, oh, it's Sunday. I need to consider the moral well-being of my ship's company.
Wow.
Was quite amazing. They got through the Dardanelles. They spent about a week in the Sea of Marmara, but in fact they had been damaged, and it ended up that they were approached by a Turkish gunship, gunboat, and found that they couldn't dive. So he got all the crew up onto the upper deck of the submarine. They scuttled the submarine. It sank because it was a brand new, very modern submarine, so they didn't want it falling into enemy hands. And the whole crew were captured and spent the rest of the war in a Turkish prison.
Wow.
Interestingly, his later career in the 50s and 60s, he became a West End actor and performed
Wow.
in quite a few shows. But that chapter about his penetration of the Dardanelles shows leadership qualities that are just quite extraordinary.
Yeah, no, I as a dyslexic, if there's an audio version one day, I will definitely want to listen to that. So I'll see if I can find it on Audible.
Yeah.
Thank you for that, Mike. Mike, we're now at the top tip, the 2-minute top tip. As this is a discrete piece in its own right, would you please say who you are, what you're doing now, and a couple of the jobs you've done in the past, and then share with us your 2-minute top tip, please.
My name is Mike Deeks. I'm the Group Managing Director of Blue Ocean Marine Tech Systems, and an underwater technology company based in Perth, with offices in the UK. My background is I was in the Navy for 32 years, from the age of 15 to the age of 47, primarily in submarines, but also with a surface ship command at the end there. And since then, I've worked in marine and defence industry, and was most fortunate to be asked by the West Australian government to be the West Australian Agent General based in London, which is a role where you have responsibility for the connection between the state and the UK government, but also promote trade and investment through the UK and, in fact, the whole of Europe and Israel as well. So a fascinating job that I loved immensely. So I guess I've had quite a diverse career in industry, in uniform, and in government, and I guess that's allowed me to try different styles of leadership, perhaps. But I would the advice I would give in terms of my top tip for leadership is be yourself. You can't be anyone else, and you shouldn't try and be anyone else. You need to be honest with yourself as to who you are, what your capabilities are, and also be very trustworthy to the people who are serving you, who are working for you, and in fact everybody, even peers and superiors as well. The best question I found to ask when I was confronted with a problem, because it allowed me to, I guess, shape the way I responded, was, how long is it before you need an answer? Is this an instantaneous thing where I've got to make a decision based on my own knowledge and capabilities? Or is this one where I can seek advice, get a more of a collegiate position, and perhaps a much better outcome than if I was making the decision by myself? And then the final part of my top tip is one that I learned when I did the Submarine Command Corps Perisher. And you're in the middle of the control room. There's a lot of things happening. You're trying to make 101 decisions in your mind. Every one of them's got to be right. The instructor on the course, teacher, is looking at you to see that you're on top of everything that's going on. And he can see you're a little confused about what you should do. And my teacher said to me at the time, Captain, they call you Captain, you're in command at the time, Captain, attack what you can see. And I've lived by that advice ever since. And the way I've translated that is, if it's over the horizon and you can't see it, you may know that something's there, But unless you can control it or influence it, you can't do much about it. So deal with the problem that's in front of you, and the subsequent problems will reveal themselves in due course. And I've lived a lot of my life, a lot of my leadership roles with that in the forefront of my mind. And I've told a lot of my staff in the various organisations I've worked for about that. And I'm delighted to say that several of them have reminded me of that some years later. Attack what you can see, Captain.
Yeah, well, great advice, Mike. And Scotty was so right to recommend you onto the series. Thank you very much for being our guest and sharing your wisdom. And for those listening, please, if you've enjoyed Mike and the discussion we've had, like it, follow us, write a review on Apple or Spotify or YouTube, and share it with a friend, someone who you think could do with some of the leadership tips and techniques that Mike and other commanders and CEOs and leaders and explorers have shared. So thank you once again, Mike.
My pleasure, Jonathan. It's been an absolute joy.